Everyone's heard of the Blitzkrieg. Everyone's seen the maps with those bold black arrows slashing across Poland, France, the Low Countries. Clean lines, decisive movement, unstoppable momentum. And then came June 22nd, 1941, and those same arrows slashed into the Soviet Union, and for a while, it looked like the same story. Panzers racing forward, infantry struggling to keep up, entire Soviet armies encircled, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, vast stretches of territory swallowed in days. The largest military operation in human history, and it was moving so fast that the men at the top, Hitler, Brauchitsch, Halder, actually started debating whether it was already over. It wasn't. Not even close. And the reason it wasn't has very little to do with Soviet resistance in those first weeks, and almost everything to do with something so unglamorous, so technical, so thoroughly uncinematic that most documentaries skip past it in a single sentence. The Railheads couldn't keep up. That's the story nobody wants to sit with, because it doesn't have the drama of a tank battle or the tragedy of an encirclement. It's about railway gauges and fuel dumps and horse-drawn wagons sinking into mud. It's about the catastrophic gap that opened up between the tip of the German spear, those fast-moving panzer divisions racing east, and the logistical system that was supposed to keep them alive. And when you actually understand what that gap meant, not just abstractly, but in terms of real tanks sitting idle with empty fuel tanks, real soldiers going hungry, real momentum grinding to a halt at the worst possible moment, everything else about Operation Barbarossa starts to make a different kind of sense. So if you've ever wondered why Germany didn't take Moscow in 1941, why the German army that looked invincible in July was frozen and exhausted by December, this is your answer. Not the one most people give you, the real one. Stay with this, because it gets more complicated and more fascinating the deeper you go. And if this is the kind of history that makes you think, that actually changes how you see the war, make sure you subscribe. There's a lot more where this comes from. Let's start at the beginning, not June 22nd, 1941. Earlier than that. Let's start with the problem that the Germans knew about before a single soldier crossed the border, the problem they chose to underestimate anyway. Germany in 1941 was a military machine that had conquered most of Western Europe in roughly 6 weeks. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway. These were not trivial victories. The French army was considered by many to be the finest in the world. The British Expeditionary Force was professional, experienced, and well-equipped. And yet the Wehrmacht had cut through them with a speed that stunned not just the world, but the Germans themselves. The Blitzkrieg worked, more than worked. It seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare entirely. But here's the thing that gets lost in the celebration of those early victories. Western Europe is small. Distances in France are manageable. The road network is excellent. The rail infrastructure, built over decades to support dense industrial economies, is extensive and standardized. When German logistics struggled in France, and they did struggle, the front lines were never far enough away for it to become a catastrophic crisis. Fuel could still reach the panzers. Ammunition could still flow forward. Spare parts could make it to where they were needed. The system was stressed, sometimes severely, but it held. The Soviet Union is not France. This is a fact that sounds obvious, but was apparently not obvious enough to the people planning Barbarossa. The distances involved are of a completely different order of magnitude. From the German border to Moscow is roughly 1,600 kilometers. From the border to Leningrad is over 1,400 kilometers. From the border to Kiev is around 800 kilometers. And Kiev is not even close to the far objectives of the campaign. These aren't just bigger numbers. They represent a fundamentally different logistical challenge, one that grows exponentially more difficult the further you advance. Now add to those distances the state of Soviet infrastructure. The road network in the Western Soviet Union in 1941 was, by Western European standards, almost non-existent. There were a handful of paved highways, but they were the exception. The vast majority of roads were unpaved tracks that turned into rivers of mud when it rained and became soft, treacherous surfaces that swallowed wheeled vehicles whole. The Germans had a word for this, Schlammperiode, the mud period. They would learn what it meant very personally before the year was out. And then there was the railway problem. This is the one that sits at the absolute center of everything. The Soviet Union used a different railway gauge than the rest of Europe. European standard gauge is 1,435 millimeters between the rails. The Soviet gauge, sometimes called Russian gauge or broad gauge, is 1,520 millimeters. That difference of 85 millimeters doesn't sound like much, but it means that no standard European railway locomotive or car can simply roll onto a Soviet track and keep moving. The equipment has to be converted, regauged, rebuilt, or replaced. Every single kilometer of Soviet track that Germany captured had to be converted to standard European gauge before German trains could use it. And the Soviet Union, in the time before and immediately after the German invasion, would make absolutely sure that as little intact, usable railway infrastructure as possible fell into German hands. The German army was deeply, structurally, almost fatally dependent on railways for its logistics. This was not a choice they had made carelessly. It was the reality of operating a modern mass army. A single panzer division, one of the spearhead units that everyone celebrates in the history books, consumed roughly 300 tons of supplies per day when actively fighting. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies, oil, all of it had to move from Germany to the front. The only way to move that volume of material over the distances involved was by train. Everything else, the trucks, the horse-drawn wagons, the motorcycles, all of that was essentially the last mile of the supply chain. It got things from the railhead, the point where the train stopped, to the front line. But the railhead had to exist. The trains had to be able to get there. And in the Soviet Union, that was the problem that would never fully be solved. Before Barbarossa even launched, German planners identified the railway gauge issue as a major concern. The solution they came up with was to have railway engineer units follow the advancing army, converting captured Soviet tracks to standard gauge as fast as humanly possible. On paper, the conversion could proceed at a rate of maybe 20 to 25 kilometers of track per day under favorable conditions. In practice, conditions were rarely favorable. The Soviets destroyed bridges, blew up track sections, removed or disabled locomotives, and in some cases, tore up rails entirely and carried them away. Every piece of destruction added time and labor to the German conversion effort. The German plan called for the campaign to be essentially over within 8 to 12 weeks. That timeline wasn't just optimism, it was a logistical necessity. The German supply chain was designed around the assumption that the campaign would be short. The stockpiles they had assembled, enormous by any previous standard, were calculated to support a rapid advance and a decisive victory before the real strain set in. If the campaign dragged on, if the front lines kept moving east beyond what the converted rail network could support, the spearheads would outrun their supplies. And that is exactly what happened. Let's talk about what a railhead actually is and why it matters so much. A railhead is simply the most forward point that a functioning railway line reaches. It's where the trains stop and the supplies are unloaded. From there, everything has to move by road, which in 1941 on the Eastern Front primarily meant trucks and horse-drawn wagons. The distance between the railhead and the front line is called the supply gap, and managing that gap is one of the most critical tasks in any sustained military operation. Keep the gap short and supply flows efficiently. Let the gap grow too long and the whole thing starts to break down. German doctrine recognized this. German army planners had built their operational concepts around keeping that supply gap manageable. The rule of thumb was that motor transport could effectively bridge a gap of about 150 to 200 kilometers. Beyond that, you started losing efficiency rapidly because the trucks themselves consumed fuel covering the distance, leaving less capacity for the supplies they were supposed to be delivering. And the further the front moved without the railheads catching up, the worse this problem became in a compounding way. Trucks that could have made 2 round trips a day to a closer railhead could only make 1 to a more distant one. The effective supply capacity dropped by half, then by more than half. Then it dropped below the level needed to sustain operations. In June 1941, when Barbarossa began, the German panzers moved with startling speed. Army Group Center, which was driving toward Smolensk and ultimately Moscow, had 2 panzer groups, Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group in the north and Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group in the south. Together they formed a massive armored force that drove deep into Soviet territory, completing the Minsk encirclement by late June, a pocket that eventually yielded around 300,000 prisoners. Then came the Smolensk encirclement in July, another massive operation that netted hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. These were genuinely spectacular military achievements. But while the panzers were racing forward, the railway conversion teams were working frantically behind them and losing the race. By the time the panzers reached the area around Smolensk, roughly 700 kilometers into Soviet territory, the nearest functioning standard gauge railway was still hundreds of kilometers to the rear. The supply gap had grown far beyond what motor transport could comfortably bridge, and the motor transport available to the German army on the Eastern Front was, it turned out, nowhere near sufficient for the task. Here is a number that makes this concrete. At the start of Barbarossa, the German army on the Eastern Front had approximately 600,000 motor vehicles of various types. That sounds like a lot. It isn't. Not for what was being asked of them. Many of these vehicles were not military trucks built for off-road use in difficult conditions. Many were requisitioned civilian vehicles from across occupied Europe, French delivery vans, Belgian automobiles, Dutch commercial trucks. They were diverse in type, diverse in age, diverse in mechanical condition, and servicing them was a logistical nightmare because they used different spare parts, different oil grades, different everything. When they broke down, and they broke down constantly on Soviet roads, fixing them was far harder than it would have been with a standardized military fleet. The horse is the other part of this equation that people forget. The German army in 1941 was not a fully mechanized force, not remotely. The popular image of the Wehrmacht as a sleek, motorized, modern fighting machine is largely a myth. The reality is that the German army was heavily dependent on horses, more than 1 million of them for Barbarossa alone. Artillery pieces, supply wagons, ambulances, field kitchens, much of this was horse-drawn. Horses could move supplies in conditions that defeated wheeled vehicles. They could navigate unpaved tracks that swallowed trucks. But they were slow, they needed to be fed and watered, and they died in large numbers under the strain of the campaign. The supply system that was supposed to move materiel from railheads to front lines was therefore a chaotic mix of trucks breaking down on terrible roads and horse-drawn wagons moving at walking pace, and neither was adequate. Let's get into the specific mechanics of what happened as the summer progressed. By late July 1941, the forward German panzer units were consuming fuel at rates that the logistical system simply could not match. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, one of the most powerful armored formations in the world at that moment, was repeatedly running short of fuel at critical moments. This wasn't because Germany didn't have fuel. Germany had stockpiled substantial fuel reserves for the campaign. The problem was getting that fuel from the stockpiles, which were tied to the railheads, forward to the tanks. When a panzer division ran out of fuel, it stopped. Hundreds of tanks and support vehicles sat idle, burning precious time, waiting for the fuel trucks to catch up. And it wasn't just fuel. Ammunition was equally critical. A tank battle consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, and the German panzer crews fighting through the summer of 1941 were often engaging in multiple engagements per day. Shells had to be replenished, and replenishment required those same supply trucks to make those same long, difficult journeys over those same terrible roads. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they broke down on the way back and the troops at the front waited. Spare parts were perhaps the most insidious problem of all. Tank engines in 1941 were not reliable by modern standards. They required frequent maintenance and occasional replacement of components that wore out under the strain of continuous operations. The German tanks of 1941, the Panzer III and Panzer IV that formed the backbone of the panzer divisions, were good vehicles but not perfect ones. Operating them in the dust and heat of a Soviet summer was hard on engines, hard on tracks, hard on every mechanical system. Keeping a panzer division at anything approaching full operational strength required a constant flow of spare parts, and those spare parts had to come from Germany, had to move by train to the nearest railhead, and then had to travel by truck to wherever they were needed. When the gap between railhead and front grew too large, spare parts didn't arrive, tanks broke down and stayed broken down, and panzer divisions that started the campaign at 200 or 250 operational tanks found themselves fielding 100, then 80, then fewer. There is a passage in Guderian's memoirs, Panzer Leader, that captures this situation with uncomfortable clarity. He writes about the frustration of having a powerful armored force theoretically capable of decisive action, but unable to act decisively because it lacked the fuel to move. He describes watching the operational window close, the moment when a swift blow could have achieved something decisive passing, while his tanks sat waiting for supply trucks that were hours, sometimes days, behind schedule. He was not alone in this experience. Hoth, Kleist, Hopner, the other panzer commanders of Barbarossa, all described variations of the same problem. The spear was sharp, but the arm holding it was starving. The German High Command was aware of these problems. They discussed them, debated them, argued about them in their evening conferences and their situation reports. The Quartermaster General of the Army, Eduard Wagner, was sending increasingly alarmed reports about the state of supply. The Army's chief logistician was not a dramatic figure in the way that Guderian or Rommel were dramatic, but his reports, when you read them today, are some of the most chilling documents of the entire campaign. He was tracking, week by week, the growing crisis in supply, the failure of the railways to keep up with the advance, the wearing out of the motor transport fleet, the death of horses in numbers that couldn't be replaced, and he was saying, clearly and in writing, that the system was reaching its limits. One of the most consequential decisions of the entire war, Hitler's order in late July and August 1941 to divert Army Group Center's panzers north and south rather than continuing the drive on Moscow, is usually discussed in terms of strategy. Did Hitler make a mistake? Was Guderian right that driving on Moscow was the correct move? These debates fill entire books. But what often gets lost is the logistical dimension. Even before Hitler's directive, Army Group Center's advance on Moscow was running out of steam for supply reasons. The panzers didn't have enough fuel to sustain a continuous drive on Moscow at full operational tempo. The pause that Hitler imposed was, from a logistical standpoint, not entirely unwelcome to the quartermaster's staff. They needed time for the railways to catch up. They needed time to rebuild the supply stockpiles that had been consumed in the summer's fighting. Whether the time was used wisely for those purposes is another question. The Kiev encirclement of September 1941, which is often cited as one of the greatest tactical victories in military history, encircling and destroying an entire Soviet front group and capturing more than 600,000 prisoners, was made possible by exactly the kind of deep panzer thrust that Guderian's group executed sweeping down from the north to link up with Kleist's group driving up from the south. It was a genuine masterpiece of operational maneuver, and it consumed the last reserves of operational momentum that Army Group Center had before the autumn mud season arrived. When Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, finally began in October 1941, the German army was already in a degraded state. Not visibly, not catastrophically, but measurably. Panzer divisions that had started the campaign with 200 or more operational tanks were fielding 70, 80, sometimes fewer. Trucks were wearing out faster than they could be replaced. The horse population had suffered significant losses. And the railways, despite the best efforts of the railway engineer units, had not been converted far enough east to support an advance all the way to Moscow. The initial phase of Typhoon was stunning. The Vyazma and Bryansk encirclements of early October yielded another enormous haul of prisoners, possibly 600,000 or more. The road to Moscow seemed open, and then the rains came. The autumn mud season, the Rasputitsa, is not a secret in Russian history. Every Russian knows about it. The ground in western Russia and Ukraine does not freeze smoothly and cleanly as the temperature drops in autumn. Instead, the rains of October and early November turn the unpaved roads into a substance that defies description. Not quite mud, not quite soup, something with the consistency of wet concrete that grabs at wheels and hooves and boots and doesn't let go. Wheeled vehicles sank to their axles. Tracked vehicles moved, but slowly and with enormous fuel consumption. Horse-drawn wagons became almost useless. The roads, such as they were, effectively ceased to exist as roads and became obstacles. German supply, already stretched to its limits, collapsed almost entirely during the mud season. Trucks that had been making one round trip per day from railhead to front couldn't make any trips. They sat mired in mud or moved at walking pace, consuming more fuel than they delivered. Supply stockpiles at the front evaporated. Panzer divisions ran out of fuel again. But this time, there was no quick fix because the problem wasn't just the distance to the railhead. The roads themselves were impassable. And the railways? The nearest standard gauge railhead to Army Group Center's forward positions was still hundreds of kilometers to the rear. The railway conversion teams had been working around the clock, but they were fighting against enormous obstacles. Soviet demolition teams had done a thorough job of destroying bridges, and bridges took weeks to repair. The further east the front moved, the longer and more vulnerable the converted rail line became, exposed to Soviet partisan attacks, to airstrikes, to simple mechanical failure over hundreds of kilometers of hastily repaired track. There is a specific railway bottleneck that logistics historians point to as emblematic of the whole problem: The rail line through Smolensk was one of the primary supply routes for Army Group Center's advance toward Moscow. It was converted from Soviet to standard gauge over the summer. But the capacity of a single converted rail line is limited by the number of trains that can run on it, the speed they can travel on potentially substandard track, and the bottlenecks created by bridges, switching points, and loading facilities. Even running trains continuously, this one line could not deliver anything close to the supplies needed by an army group conducting major offensive operations, and when it was damaged, when a bridge was blown or a section of track was hit, everything behind it backed up and nothing got through at all. The German railway system itself was under enormous strain by the autumn of 1941. Operating 3 army groups across the vast distances of the Eastern Front, while simultaneously supporting the occupation of Western Europe and meeting the needs of the German war economy, required more trains than Germany actually had. Locomotives wore out, cars needed maintenance, crews were exhausted. The Reich's Ministry of Transport was constantly juggling competing demands, and the Eastern Front, despite its strategic priority, was always competing for resources with everything else. Now let's talk about a specific comparison that makes the scale of this problem viscerally clear. In the summer of 1941, the Army Group Center required approximately 30 trains per day to meet its minimum supply needs. These aren't generous estimates. They're the minimum needed to keep the force functional. At the peak of the summer advance, the converted railway could deliver somewhere between 8 and 16 trains per day to the forward areas, depending on conditions. That is a gap so large that it doesn't look like a supply problem. It looks like an impossibility. The Army Group was running on less than half of what it needed, and sometimes much less than that. The shortfall was made up, partially, by stripping supplies from less active sectors, by imposing rationing on everything from fuel to food, by driving trucks to destruction to get the last ton of supplies forward, and by essentially gambling that the campaign would end before the situation became irretrievable. This is the structural gamble at the heart of Barbarossa. It wasn't just a strategic gamble that the Soviet Union would collapse when struck hard enough. It was also a logistical gamble that the campaign would end before the supply system failed catastrophically. Both gambles lost. Let me tell you about the fuel situation in specific terms, because the numbers are striking when you look at them closely. A German Panzer III consumed roughly 500 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers of road travel. Cross-country movement, which was much of what the Panzers did in the Soviet Union, consumed dramatically more fuel than road movement, sometimes 3 to 4 times as much. A full Panzer division's fuel consumption during an active operational day could easily reach 150,000 to 200,000 liters or more. Delivering that fuel from a railhead, even 150 kilometers away, required a substantial number of truck trips, each consuming fuel of their own, each wear on the trucks themselves, each dependent on those roads being passable. During the summer of 1941, there were multiple documented instances of Guderian's and Hoth's panzer groups halting operations not because of enemy resistance, but because they had run out of fuel. At the Beresina River crossing in late June, Guderian's leading elements had to wait for fuel resupply before they could continue their advance. Near Vitebsk in July, fuel shortages forced operational pauses. These pauses, each measured in hours or days, collectively added up to something significant. Each pause was a window for the Red Army to reorganize, to bring up reserves, to dig in, to recover from the shock of the initial assault. The German army was not the only one learning lessons in the summer of 1941. The Soviets were learning them too, and with every week that passed, they were getting better at fighting the kind of war they were now in. The German army's response to the logistics crisis evolved over the summer. One approach was to simply demand more from the existing supply system, to push the truck drivers harder, to reduce maintenance cycles, to run locomotives until they broke. This worked in the short term, but accelerated the wear and tear on the very equipment the system depended on. Another approach was to strip supplies from rear areas and second-line units to feed the spearheads. This maintained combat power at the front at the cost of weakening the broader force. A third approach was to capture Soviet supplies, and this worked surprisingly well in some areas. The enormous Soviet dumps captured in the encirclement battles contained substantial quantities of fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts that could sometimes be used by German forces, but this was opportunistic and unreliable. You couldn't plan an operation around the assumption that you'd capture enough Soviet fuel to keep it moving. The most systematic German response to the logistics crisis was to invest heavily in railway conversion, and German railway engineer units performed genuinely remarkable feats during Barbarossa. They converted thousands of kilometers of Soviet track, rebuilt bridges that Soviet demolition teams had dropped, and maintained the lines under constant pressure from partisan attacks and the general chaos of the campaign. But they were always behind, always catching up, rather than being ahead of the advance. The panzers moved in days, the railways moved in weeks, and that fundamental mismatch between the speed of modern armored operations and the slower pace of railway engineering was never resolved. There is something deeply ironic in the history of the German army's railway operations in Russia. The Germans were, in many ways, masters of railway logistics. They had developed sophisticated techniques for railway management and conversion during the First World War, and had refined them further in the interwar period. The Reichsbahn, the German state railway, was one of the most efficient railway systems in the world. German railway engineer units were professional, experienced, and well-equipped, and yet all of that expertise, all of that capability, was simply not enough to bridge the gap between what the campaign demanded and what was physically possible. One reason for this is a factor that doesn't appear in most operational histories but matters enormously: the condition of Soviet railway infrastructure beyond the tracks themselves. Converting the gauge of a track is one problem, but Soviet locomotive maintenance facilities, water towers for steam engines, coaling stations, signal equipment, station facilities, all of these were either destroyed by retreating Soviet forces or were designed for broad-gauge equipment that couldn't be used by standard German rolling stock. Even after a stretch of track was converted to standard gauge, the supporting infrastructure might still be missing or broken. A locomotive running low on water in the middle of a converted stretch of track with no functioning water tower was a serious operational problem that took time and resources to solve. The Soviet Union also had a significant advantage that is rarely discussed in Western histories of Barbarossa. The Soviet railway system, while primarily built to broad gauge, included a substantial number of narrow gauge lines, branch lines, and industrial railways that didn't factor neatly into either gauge system. These could sometimes be used by German forces, sometimes not. But more importantly, the Soviets were able to use their own broad gauge system with complete efficiency throughout the campaign, even as the Germans were struggling with conversion. Soviet trains could move from the Urals to the front without any gauge change required. German trains stopped at the Polish border and had to transfer everything or wait for regauging. This was a structural asymmetry that favored the Soviet side in ways that compounded over time. Now let's move forward to the autumn of 1941 and the specific catastrophe of Operation Typhoon. When the German forces began their drive on Moscow in October, the supply situation was, to put it generously, marginal. The attack began with carefully accumulated stockpiles, supplies that had been built up during the pause in major operations in September. These stockpiles were real and substantial. German forces were not starving when Typhoon began, but those stockpiles had to carry the operation through to its conclusion, and if the operation took longer than expected, or consumed supplies faster than expected, there was no margin for error. The early encirclement battles consumed supplies faster than expected. Then the mud arrived and made replenishment almost impossible. The stockpiles burned down, and as they burned down, the decisions available to German commanders became progressively narrower. You couldn't advance vigorously if your tanks were rationing fuel. You couldn't suppress Soviet defensive positions if your artillery was rationing shells. You couldn't maintain the operational tempo needed to prevent the Soviets from stabilizing their front. By November 1941, the mud had partially frozen, which paradoxically improved mobility somewhat. The ground hardened enough for vehicles to move again, but now the temperature was dropping, and dropping fast, and the German army was not equipped for a Russian winter. The supply crisis that had previously manifested as a shortage of fuel and ammunition now added a new dimension: a shortage of winter clothing, winter lubricants, antifreeze for vehicle engines, all the equipment needed to operate in temperatures that would drop to -30, -40 Celsius. Why didn't Germany have winter equipment? The official line is that no one expected the campaign to last into winter, and while that's partially true, the full answer is more uncomfortable. The German army, or at least elements of it, had requested winter equipment. The quartermaster's staff had flagged the need. But shipping winter clothing and equipment to the Eastern Front in the autumn of 1941 competed for the same railway capacity as ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. And those supplies took priority. The railways that were supposed to be delivering winter gear were overwhelmed with the basic needs of keeping the force operational at all. Winter clothing, categorized as a lower priority, got bumped. The men at the front froze in their summer uniforms. And those uniforms were not just uncomfortable. In a Russian winter, the wrong clothing was a death sentence. The failure to deliver winter equipment is perhaps the starkest illustration of what happens when a logistical system operates without margin. When there is plenty of railway capacity, everything gets through. When capacity is strained, priorities have to be set. When capacity is catastrophically insufficient, even things that everyone agrees are necessary don't get through. The German supply system in the autumn and early winter of 1941 was in that third category. It couldn't meet the Army's minimum needs. Everything was a crisis, and in a world where everything is a crisis, even the most obviously important things, like warm clothing, can get pushed aside by things that feel even more urgent in the moment. Let's look at some specific numbers that put the railway gap in perspective. The German Army's railway transport targets for the Eastern Front in the late summer and autumn of 1941 called for an average of 24 supply trains per day for each of the three Army groups. That's 72 trains per day for the entire Eastern Front. The actual number of trains arriving in the forward areas consistently fell short of this target. For Army Group Center alone, the average during the critical period of August and September 1941 was somewhere around 16 to 18 trains per day against a requirement of 24. That sounds like a manageable shortfall until you realize that even the 24-train target was itself a reduced requirement based on assumed consumption rates that proved to be too optimistic. The Quartermaster General's office tracked what they called the Versorgungslage, the supply situation, with meticulous German precision. Their records, which survived the war and have been studied extensively by military historians, tell a story of progressive degradation. In June 1941, supply was adequate. Stressed, but adequate. By July, the system was clearly strained. By August, the shortfalls were operationally significant. By September, the situation was described in internal reports as critical. By October, as typhoon began and the mud arrived, the word used was frequently catastrophic. These are not my words. These are the words that appear in the original German documents. Eduard Wagner, the Quartermaster General, sent a personal letter to his wife in late October 1941 that has become famous among historians of the Eastern Front. In it, he described feeling as though he was watching a machine running itself to destruction, knowing exactly what was happening, unable to stop it. That's the emotional texture of the logistics crisis on the Eastern Front in 1941. Not dramatic, not explosive, just relentless, grinding, inexorable failure. Now let's step back and think about why this happened at a structural level. Why did the German spearheads outrun their railheads? There are several reasons, and they interact with each other in ways that made the problem self-reinforcing. The first reason is the fundamental speed asymmetry between armored operations and railway conversion. A panzer division moving aggressively could cover 50, 60, even 80 kilometers in a day under favorable conditions. A railway conversion team, working as fast as physically possible, could convert perhaps 20 to 25 kilometers of track per day under favorable conditions, and Soviet conditions were rarely favorable. This means that every day of rapid advance, the gap between railhead and front grew by 30 to 60 kilometers. Multiply that by weeks of operation and you get a gap of several hundred kilometers that motor transport was supposed to bridge. It couldn't. The second reason is Soviet infrastructure destruction. This is not sufficiently appreciated in most Western accounts of Barbarossa. The Soviets did not simply retreat. They destroyed as they went, methodically, systematically, and with increasing effectiveness as the weeks passed. Bridges were dropped, rail lines were torn up, locomotives were either moved east or disabled, stations and maintenance facilities were demolished. This destruction multiplied the time and effort required for German railway conversion. Every bridge that had to be rebuilt added days or weeks to the timeline. The longer it took to convert a line, the further the front had moved, the worse the supply gap became. The third reason is the inadequacy of German motor transport, both in quantity and quality. Germany in 1941 did not have enough trucks to substitute for railway supply over the distances involved in the Soviet campaign. The trucks that existed were a diverse, poorly maintained fleet of partially civilian vehicles that broke down in large numbers on Soviet roads. The horse-drawn transport that supplemented them was slow and limited in capacity. There was simply no mechanical substitute for railways over long distances and in large volumes. The Wehrmacht had been designed around railways. When the railways failed to keep up, there was no backup system that could fill the gap. The fourth reason is the German army's planning assumptions, which were built around a short campaign and proved spectacularly wrong. The logistical planning for Barbarossa was based on the premise that the Soviet Union would collapse within 8 to 12 weeks of the initial assault. This premise was shared, with varying degrees of confidence, by virtually the entire German military leadership. If that premise had been correct, the logistical shortfalls might have been manageable. The campaign would have ended before they became fatal. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. It bent. It broke in places. But it did not collapse. And every week that the campaign continued beyond the planned end date, the logistical situation deteriorated further. The fifth reason, and perhaps the most fundamental, is scale. The Soviet Union is simply enormous. No army in history had attempted to sustain offensive operations at this scale, this depth, over such distance, with such poor infrastructure. The Germans were doing something that had never been done before, and the tools they brought to the task, the railways, the trucks, the horses, the supply system, were simply not adequate to the scale of the undertaking. This is not necessarily a criticism. The scale of the Soviet Union was genuinely without precedent in the history of warfare. It might have broken any army's logistics system, but it broke Germany's, and that breaking was the beginning of the end of the campaign. There's a story that Heinz Guderian tells in his memoirs about a meeting with Hitler in August 1941, when Guderian traveled to Rastenburg to argue against the diversion of his panzer group to the Kiev operation and in favor of continuing toward Moscow. The meeting is usually analyzed as a strategic debate. But what Guderian was also dealing with, what he doesn't quite say but which is clear from the context, was that his force was logistically exhausted. His panzer group had been in continuous operations for nearly 2 months over distances and in conditions that no armored formation had ever operated before. Even if Hitler had agreed to the Moscow drive, Guderian's tanks were not in the condition they had been in on June 22nd. They needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and above all time for the railway system to catch up. The pause imposed by the Kiev operation was, from one angle, a strategic mistake that cost Germany the chance to take Moscow in 1941. From another angle, it was a pause that the logistical system desperately needed. The supplies stockpiled during August and September, the partial recovery of the motor transport fleet, the extension of the converted rail lines a few hundred kilometers further east, all of this happened during the period when Army Group Center's panzers were reoriented toward Kiev. Whether it was enough, whether a better planned logistics system could have enabled a successful drive on Moscow in the autumn, is one of the great counterfactual questions of the war. Most serious historians of the Eastern Front have concluded that it probably wasn't enough. Not because of Hitler's decision or anyone's strategic mistake, but because the railway conversion had simply not progressed far enough. Even with everything working as well as it possibly could, the German supply system in the autumn of 1941 could not have delivered sufficient fuel, ammunition, and supplies to maintain the operational tempo needed to take Moscow before winter. The math didn't work. The distances were too great. The infrastructure was too damaged. The trucks were too few and too worn. The gap between railhead and front was too large to bridge. The winter crisis of 1941 to 1942 confirmed everything that the pessimists among the German planners had feared. When the Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5, 1941, the German army on the Eastern Front was in a state of logistical and physical exhaustion that made it almost unable to resist. Panzer divisions that had once numbered 200 tanks were fielding 20 or 30 operational vehicles. Artillery batteries were rationing their last shells. Men who had been fighting continuously for 6 months in temperatures that went from summer heat to Arctic cold in a supply system that never adequately fed them were at the edge of what human beings can endure. The Soviet counteroffensive drove the Germans back from the gates of Moscow, inflicted enormous casualties, and very nearly unraveled the entire German position on the Eastern Front. The German army survived this crisis, barely, through a combination of Hitler's famous halt order, which whatever its faults prevented a complete disintegration of the front, and the fighting qualities of the German soldier at the small unit level, which remained remarkable even in conditions of extreme deprivation. But the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht, the machine that had conquered Europe in weeks, was shattered, and the logistical reality that the myth had always obscured was laid bare in the snow around Moscow. What lessons should we draw from all of this? What does the story of the German spearheads and the failing railheads actually tell us? The first lesson is about the relationship between strategy and logistics. Operational brilliance, which the German army unquestionably possessed in 1941, cannot substitute for logistical adequacy. You can plan the most elegant encirclement in history. You can outmaneuver your enemy at every tactical level. But if your tanks run dry of fuel 50 kilometers short of the objective, the brilliance is wasted. Strategy and logistics have to work together. Strategy without logistics is just fantasy. The second lesson is about the dangers of planning assumptions. The entire German logistical plan for Barbarossa rested on the assumption of a short campaign. When that assumption proved wrong, there was no contingency plan. The German military had not planned for a long campaign because planning for a long campaign would have meant acknowledging that the campaign might not be short. That acknowledgement was politically and psychologically impossible in the context of 1941 Germany. So the planning assumptions were set to match what was hoped for rather than what was realistic, and the consequences were catastrophic. The third lesson is about scale and the limits of experience. The German army in 1941 was drawing on operational experience from campaigns in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and North Africa. All of those campaigns had been shorter, in smaller theaters, over better infrastructure. The lessons they had learned from those campaigns were real and valuable, but they were not adequate preparation for the Soviet Union. The scale of the Eastern Front was qualitatively different from anything that had come before. The Germans knew this intellectually, but didn't fully internalize what it meant for their supply system. Experience from smaller theaters created false confidence about what was possible in a much larger one. The fourth lesson is about the Soviet capacity for infrastructure denial. The systematic destruction of railways, bridges, and supply facilities as the Soviet forces retreated was an enormous force multiplier. It cost relatively little in terms of Soviet resources to destroy a bridge. It cost Germany weeks of effort and scarce resources to rebuild it. This asymmetry between the ease of destruction and the difficulty of reconstruction shaped the entire campaign. Every bridge,